Chapter 5 of your textbook is entitled Intersections. And as the title implies, this chapter is primarily going to be about intersectionality and how our different social identities influence the ways in which we do gender, which the authors refer to as gender strategies. But before we get into those specific gender strategies, let's go over the question of the chapter. And that question is, if gender is just one part of who we are, why isn't it crowded out by all the other things about us that are meaningful and consequential? So in short, it's kind of like, if there are all these things that make up who we are, why does gender remain so relevant? Why isn't it subsumed by one of these other identities? So before we get to answering that question, let's just kind of go over some terminology, some of which is highlighted in your book and some of which I'm providing you now. So first of all, when we're talking about intersectionality, the idea that we have these intersecting identities that kind of structure, that position our place within the social structure, that shape our identity, shapes, what privileges are afforded us, shapes what structural barriers are placed ahead of us, shapes how people perceive us. And so how your authors refer to these different identities is they refer to them as social identities. And you maybe have seen this before as being referred to as social statuses. And it's pretty much the same definition, regardless of which one you use. And it's just the idea that these are socially defined positions in society. So that means that these are identities or statuses that are largely recognizable by other people you share a society with, right? So this isn't an identity or a status that you make up yourself, but it is identity or status that is available to you or is assigned to you by the society that you live in. And so all of us have multiple social identities, and that is and these multiple social identities, we experience them concurrently. So we don't go through our life, just being our gender or just being our race or just being our sexual orientation. But it is a kind of concurrent experience, a lived in identity that is rooted in all of these individual identities. And so this concept of intersectionality, it comes from a Black female academic, Kimberly Crenshaw. And your book relates this concept of intersectionality to an additional concept, which is the concept of privilege. And although there are a lot of different people with a lot of different definitions of privilege, the one that I like the most comes from Peggy McIntosh, and she's written about this from the perspective of white privilege, male privilege, heterosexual privilege. I give you a link to an excerpt of her list of privileges that she associates with white privilege. But here's this definition that she uses. It's the idea that privilege is an invisible knapsack of unearned advantages that people can call upon when needed, when necessary. And I love that definition because there are just so many kind of important kind of concepts embedded in there. The idea that it's invisible. So oftentimes when you have privilege, you don't even realize you have it. The idea that it's a knapsack, right? So it's a collection, it's a constellation of things that you enjoy. And like any knapsack, right? What is the purpose of a knapsack? It carries things and you can go in it and get things as you need them. In essence, this is how she's saying privilege works, right? It's not necessarily, that you call upon your privilege consciously or even subconsciously, all throughout your day, every moment of the day, but it's the idea that those privileges are there waiting for you when you need them. And so the thing about intersectionality is, when you think about it in conjunction to privilege, is that because we all have different social identities, some of our identities imbue us with privilege, and some of our identities are not privileged identities, aren't statuses in society that enjoy privilege. And so that concept relates to the idea of matrix of domination. And that is another theorist, Patricia Hill Collins, And I don't know why I misspelled that there, but I did. It's not Hills Collins, but Hill Collins. And it's the idea that we all have this kind of personal matrix of identities in which we are either dominant or subordinate. And so, although we oftentimes talk about privilege, as this straightforward thing like, oh, yes, I have gender privilege, or I have sexual orientation privilege, or I have race privilege. When you think of it from this matrix of domination type of standpoint, it's this idea that we all have this kind of unique, individuated matrix of ways in which we're oppressed and ways in which, we are privileged. And, we're living that experience of that mix of privileges and disadvantages daily. And so just kind of keep that in mind, even as we start talking about these gender strategies and we talk about them, and how they intersect with these other identities, we do it like, one at a time. How does gender intersect with class? How does it intersect with race? How does it intersect with sexuality, sexual orientation? But once again, how people live it is an amalgamation of all of these identities with all of their associated privileges and disadvantages. And so, going back to that question, if we have all these identities, why doesn't gender get crowded out? And so your book notes, gender is not an isolated social fact. It actually inflects all of our other identities. So, our racial identity, our sexual orientation, our class identities, they are all gendered. And the strategies that we employ, and I'll get to that definition there in a second, but the strategies that we employ, which ones are available to us, which ones do people accept when we use them, which ones are we able to call upon most and least successfully, that is shaped by our other identities. And so this chapter is really about gender strategies, which is just a way of doing gender that works for us as unique individuals. And, they start this chapter off by talking about some just general gender strategies. Your girly girl, your tomboy, your jock, your dork. I'm sure we can add to the list if we thought of some more. But, they're like, this gender strategy kind of gives you like a broad framework for how to do gender in that type of way, in that fashion. And then your textbook notes, we oftentimes then break the rules or cut a deal with these subcategories so that we can feel like we're being even more authentically ourselves. So, I've always been a girly girl. However, I have a kind of hard, aggressive personality, even with all the pink that I wear and the skirts and the dresses. That is how I cut my deal. That's how that gender strategy feels most normal to me. That I, even as early as 13, 14, I might be dressed like a princess and cussed like a sailor, and have spent most of my life, in the words of several ex-boyfriends, dating like a dude, right? So it's this idea that you decide upon a strategy that you like, and then you cut deals and you find a way to make it work for you personally. Now, part of how you make it work for you personally, and part of how you decide which strategies to employ, is influenced by your other social identities. And that is what the remainder of this chapter is about. It's about how do our other personal characteristics and social identities, how do they shape our gender strategies? So how I'm structuring this for this class is that in order to provide like some context for these social identities, I will be giving you some background sociological material. For those of you that have taken a lot of sociology classes, or at the very least have taken an intro sociology class, that background material is going to sound very familiar. But, this is really just to serve as a crash course for people who maybe don't have that sociological background, or as a reminder for those of you who have taken these classes, but it was a while ago. So we'll work our way through each social identity. I'll provide some sociological context, and then we'll kind of quickly talk about, what types of gender strategies your textbook discusses in regards to that social identity. So we're going to be beginning with socioeconomic status, but in order to discuss that, we're going to take a step back and talk about some other kind of concepts related to it first. So first of all, pretty much all known societies, including our own, are characterized by social inequality. We all don't have the same amount of the good stuff, and the good stuff being income, wealth, power, prestige, higher education. So there's a disparity. Some of us have a lot, some of us have a little, and some of us are in between. And we call that social inequality. Now, how society structures access to the good stuff, to those resources, we refer to that as social stratification. And this is the idea that there's a systematic ranking of different groups of people in a hierarchy of inequality. I always like to tell students, think about it as a ladder. So if the good stuff, the resources that we all want, if they're, in a tall tree, society is structured in such a way that different groups of people are placed on the rungs of a ladder so that some people have better access to the good stuff than others. And so to build on that latter example, another set of terms that are really important when you're thinking about social stratification is whether or not the system is closed or open. If the system is closed, that means there's no mobility occurring. The rung you're born on is the rung you're pretty much going to stay on for the rest of your life. It's a closed system. There's no mobility. But if the system is open, then, the rung you're born on does not have to be the rung that you remain on in your entire life. There are ways for you to get ahead, to experience upward mobility. Although it's worth noting, in order for that to happen, some people do have to fall from their perch at the upper rungs of the ladder. They have to experience downward mobility, because if not, then the kind of general mobility of society is going to be pretty limited. So the type of stratification system that we have, that most Western industrial societies have had for centuries now, is what we call a class system. And in the class system, our rungs are referred to as social classes, groups of people that share a similar level of resources and thus share a similar lifestyle. Although there are different characterizations of what this class system in the United States looks like, the one that I have always been most particular to is the sixth class system that you see depicted in that graphic, where the top class is referred to as the capitalist class. Sometimes it's referred to as the upper class. This is the top one. It's about 5%. Usually the key thing here is this is definitely where people who live off of their wealth more than their income, whether that's due to investments or inheritance. This is that class of people. Then you have the upper middle class. These are the group of people, they make six figures or more, and there are professionals. They did not just go to college, they went to some type of postgraduate, usually professional education. Your doctors, your attorneys, your stockbrokers, your pharmacist, right? Your dentist. So that is that group. Lower middle is kind of a mixed group, because some people are in lower middle due to their income, meaning they make about a little bit over what is median income in America. So right around, $60,000, 55 to 60,000. Sometimes they make that money because they have a college degree, but they perhaps do not have a college degree in a very well compensated field. And sometimes they make that money because they have a well compensated trade, or they own a small business. So that group can be the most diverse. Then you have the working class. in this group, you very rarely have people that have anything beyond a high school education. They are working full time, but they make about $36,000 a year. So these are not very high paid positions. Then you have working poor. So these are people who perhaps finished high school, perhaps dropped out. The key thing here is they are making about full-time minimum wage in a state where the minimum wage isn't much higher than the federal minimum wage. So it's not like they're making living wage anywhere. So these are your like laborers, your low-paid service workers, your low-paid salespeople, your fast food workers. Unless, they're working at In-N-Out, where I definitely have had my students in California check me on, how much In-N-Out workers make. But we consider these people to be working poor. And a really important distinction there is oftentimes when we talk about the poor, we are talking about the people that I'm going to talk about next, the people that, we would consider to be underclass. We talk about how the poor doesn't work, or we talk about how the poor, lives on government assistance. But it's worth noting that a large number of people in America work. But even with working, they have money that would constitute them being poor. They are right at the poverty line, or perhaps right above it. And especially if they're right above it, this can be truly significant, because it perhaps makes them less eligible for any type of government assistance programs. So as I just referenced them, we have the underclass. Oftentimes this is a group that we associate with not having a high school diploma. And they are either unemployed or only partially employed, seasonally employed. Maybe they live on some form of government assistance. It's worth noting that sometimes, someone looks like they're underclass because they aren't legally, gainfully employed, meaning that they are engaging in some type of, labor that is occurring off the books. They would still appear to be part of the underclass to the people who make these designations. So that's what's, that just kind of gives you a sense. So when we're talking about socioeconomic status, that's a fancy way of saying that we're interested in, how much money you make, but also your level of education, and also, the social status. In a lot of states, a job like a teacher, really makes closer to working class money than even lower middle class money. But because teachers, one, are educated, they have a college education, but two, they do a job that people hold in a lot of esteem, we would never put them as part of the working class, even if their income makes it seem like that's where they belong. So just know when we refer to SES, is a mixture of both social factors as well as economic factors. So your book talks about a variety of gender strategies that relate to socioeconomic status. A lot of them being statuses related to how people form families and how they kind of divvy up, economic as well as household labor duties within their families. So they talk about the breadwinner, which traditionally has been a man. And, especially in this day and age where very less jobs pay what's called a family wage, enough money to raise a family on, so now if we're talking about a breadwinner, this is usually the type of man who makes enough money for his partner to stay comfortably at home and focus on the family, so for the women who are employing that gender strategy where they are not working, and they're instead focused on their home or volunteer activities. We call that the family focused strategy. And so, I tried to pick examples from, TV to try to make this resonate a little bit more. And so, I have Betty and Don Draper from Mad Men. And it's worth noting that breadwinner, family focused, that duo was a lot more common, in the 50s and 60s, and has become a lot less common in the last couple of decades. And so what has become more common, especially as more women are going to college, choosing occupations that they're passionate about, that they love, that they don't necessarily want to set aside, when they perhaps marry and have children, is the co-breadwinner. And so, if you now have families where both people have professions that, are well compensated, and they could afford for someone to stay home, but honestly, no one wants to. And so that is a gender strategy that can be employed, right? So now, instead of that breadwinner family focus, you might have two partners who are co-breadwinners. And then they talk about sometimes a person works, but they're not working a job that really means a lot to them. It's not a profession. It's not a passion. Perhaps their partner has the type of career that involves a lot of movement, or their partner just has the type of career that involves them having to be supportive in various ways, and so they can't focus on their own career. And we call that the supportive spouse strategy. And just in terms of gender, the supportive spouse strategy is more likely to be held by a woman than by a man. So oftentimes they can't afford for the female partner to stay at home, so she can't be just family focused. But it's not like her career is supposed to be as central or as significant as her male partner. And so it is the supportive spouse. And then they talk about, okay, with the co-breadwinners, there is this assumption that because they have all that additional money, in a lot of ways, that they can afford to kind of outsource a lot of their household and maybe even child rearing duties. And in the breadwinner family focus strategies, obviously the woman is doing most of the child rearing. And the supportive spouse, that type of duo, once again, the expectation is that the woman is doing a lot of the caregiving. But the super mom, super dad, this is the idea that the person is working a job that requires a lot of their attention, but then at the same time, they're putting a lot of effort at home into, housework, child rearing. Certainly, if a person is a single parent, whether they're a single mom or a single father, then they inherently are super mom, super dad, because there is not another adult for them to split these duties with, that they are having to do it all. And that's important because how they evaluate themselves might be different than how a family-focused woman might evaluate herself, or co-breadwinner woman might evaluate themselves. So, right, it's an idea, and a lot of these strategies are about finding a way to feel good about how you are doing your gender, finding a way so that you feel like you are a winner and not a failure, by focusing on what you can do versus what you can't do. And so a good example of that are the stay-at-home dads, because this is a gender strategy that, although it's becoming increasingly more common, it is still, as your textbook notes, is still a strategy that is more likely to raise eyebrows. It's unexpected. They note that it is much more acceptable to be the super dad, like to be super involved in especially in child rearing, but then still work some type of job, even if your wife is the breadwinner, versus to be the stay-at-home dad. The stay-at-home dad is a gender strategy that more directly confronts those hegemonic masculine ideals. And so, so like a lot of these strategies related to socioeconomic class were about how do people set up and organize their families. Now, they did talk about a couple that were just strictly related to class, did not have to do with family structure. So they talked about how blue collar guys, because, that type of work isn't as well compensated as white collar jobs, it possibly could make them feel badly, right? That they're not like wealthy, man of the universe, can afford to have a wife that stays at home. But they said that, the blue collar guy strategy emphasizes, the aspects of masculinity that their line of work allows them to evidence in ways that white collar jobs do not. So the fact that they're working with their hands, they're handy, they know how to fix things, they don't mind getting dirty. If they're working construction or a job like that, there's this focus on toughness. And so once again, it allows them to feel good about doing masculinity in the way that they can do it. And it softens the blow in the ways that they can't necessarily uphold the hegemonic masculine ideal, like being well compensated or having a lot of power, in their employment area. They also talk about how for some women, especially women who are working class, because their jobs are oftentimes dirtier than what is normally expected for a woman, they might embrace what they call the tough gal strategy, that, rejecting that kind of, femininity that says you have to be dainty and clean and, you don't want to break a nail. And instead they emphasize the ways in which, that they're tough and they can keep up with the guys and they, have a career or job that, does that they're only one of a few women who have it, right? So once again, it gives them this pathway to say, I am a woman, but I am a woman in this type of way, as opposed to just saying, I reject femininity altogether.